It begins with a sound that cuts sharper than the studio lights themselves, Kellyanne Conway's voice. Shrill and cracking, ricocheting off the walls like shrapnel in a battlefield. Cameras zoom in as she leans forward, face contorted, eyes blazing, her words tumbling out in a furious avalanche that leaves the anchor frozen in disbelief. For a split second, the entire set feels like it has been knocked off balance. Viewers at home grip their remotes tighter, unsure whether they are watching a political debate or the unraveling of a public figure before their very eyes. The studio audience gasps audibly. And even through the broadcast microphones, the sound lands heavy. This wasn't a sparring match. It was a scream, the kind of uncontrolled outburst that reveals desperation more than dominance. The seasoned operatives watching from the green room exchange knowing looks. Social media ever faster. Then the broadcast itself begins stitching captions and memes before Kellyanne even draws her next breath. Her tirade, meant to intimidate, is instantly rebranded by millions as a meltdown. In that instant, the contrast becomes almost cinematic. On one side of the table, chaos incarnate, a political veteran who once prided herself on precision, now reduced to raw noise. On the other side, Jasmine Crockett sits steady, her body language calm, her eyes unwavering, her silence cutting deeper than any rebuttal could. It is the silence of someone who knows the power of patience. And with every second that Jasmine does not rise to the bait, Kellyanne's fury feels smaller, pettier, more exposed. The anchor shuffles papers nervously, attempting to reclaim control, but control has already shifted. It is no longer in Kellyanne's clenched fists or strained voice. It belongs to Jasmine, who hasn't yet said a word. Viewers lean closer to their screens, hungry for what's about to come. They sense a reversal brewing, the inevitability of calm triumphing over chaos. This is not just television ads, a turning point unfolding in real time. It's a moment destined to escape the confines of a broadcast and surge into headlines, feeds, and conversations across the country. Kellyanne screams, but history listens for Jasmine. And then, just as the shouting reaches its fever pitch, Jasmine finally leans in, lips parting with the composure of someone who knows the weight of her. Next words, the nation braces itself. Because what comes next, no one saw coming. This wasn't a throwaway cable segment buried on an afternoon news cycle. This was prime time. Millions of eyes across the nation were locked in, living rooms bathed in the glow of television sets. Phones perched on laps as audiences prepared to react in real time. It was the kind of stage where reputations are either forged into steel or shattered like glass. And tonight, two very different forces had been set on a collision course. On one side sat Kellyanne Conway, a figure who had spent years perfecting the art of political spin. She was no stranger to the cameras, no stranger to the spotlight, and certainly no stranger to confrontation. Her career had been built on sharp comebacks and reality-bending defenses, always delivered with an air of smug certainty. She carried herself like a veteran warrior, confident that no opponent could unravel her. On the other side was Jasmine Crockett, a rising star in Congress whose journey to that very stage was nothing short of remarkable. She wasn't a household name in every corner of America, at least not yet. But those who knew her story understood that she embodied the resilience of a new generation of leadership, grounded, principled, and unafraid to speak truth with grace. For Jasmine, this wasn't just another interview. It was a chance to show the country that dignity still had a place in politics. The stakes stretched far beyond. Two personalities clashing under studio lights. This was a mirror reflecting the soul of the nation. Chaos versus composure. Deception versus dignity. Arrogance versus authenticity. Viewers didn't just see two women debating. They saw the competing futures of America itself. One rooted in a politics of division, loudness, and manipulation. The other grounded in a politics of calm strength, inclusivity, and honesty. Even the atmosphere betrayed the weight of the moment. The studio air felt thick, charged, like the pause before a thunderclap. Every syllable from Kellyanne seemed to spark with hostility, as if volume itself could erase truth. But Jasmine's poise gave off the opposite energy, measured, patient, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The cameras caught it all. The fury of one, the restraint of the other. And outside the studio, an invisible audience began to mobilize. Twitter timelines shifted. Instagram stories flickered. TikTok creators prepared to clip every second. A generation fluent in the language of viral moments sensed that something seismic was about to unfold. They didn't yet know the shape of it, but they knew this would not be forgotten by morning. Why did it matter so much? Because politics in America had become more than policy debates. It had become theater, conflict, spectacle. And yet beneath the spectacle lay something deeper. The hunger for clarity, for truth, for leaders who could embody strength without losing their humanity. Jasmine's presence in that chair represented that hunger. A collective yearning for composure in an age of noise. Viewers leaned forward. Anchors shuffled nervously. The nation's pulse quickened. A scream had already shattered the silence. But the real story had not yet been written. In the balance was more than a debate. It was the credibility of voices who believed that dignity could still defeat chaos, and as millions waited. Eyes fixed on the screen, one thought lingered in the air like static electricity. Jasmine Crockett was about to make history. What came next would dominate headlines, ignite hashtags, and etch itself into America's political memory for days to come. To understand the magnitude of Kellyanne Conway's televised eruption, you have to look at the story she carried into. That studio, the story of a woman who rose to prominence by perfecting the art of manipulation, only to stumble when faced with someone who refused to play her game. Kellyanne had once been celebrated as the sharp-tongued strategist who guided Donald Trump's 2016 campaign through the firestorm of scandal and controversy. To her allies, she was a magician of messaging, someone who could spin even the most indefensible blunder into a supposed victory. To her critics, she was the embodiment of political gaslighting, a figure who twisted truth until it snapped under the weight of its own contradictions. Her appearances on Sunday shows became infamous. When pressed with a fact she didn't like, she'd sidestep it with dazzling verbal acrobatics. When challenged with evidence, she'd invent phrases like alternative facts, phrases that mocked the very idea of truth itself. She was never rattled, never flustered her, so it seemed. She'd smile with that condescending calm, projecting an aura of invincibility that infuriated her opponents and thrilled her supporters. But arrogance, like gravity, always pulls downward. Over time, cracks began to show. The confidence looked more like smugness. Clever deflections turned into exhausting word salads. Audiences who once marveled at her composure began to see the fatigue behind the mask. The persona that had carried her through the storm of Trumpism began to curdle into something more brittle, desperate. Her downfall wasn't sudden, it was slow, almost imperceptible at first. A scowl that lingered too long, a slip of frustration. In her voice, a snide insult where there used to be polished spin. Each appearance revealed a little more edge, a little less discipline. It was as though years of bending truth had left her with nothing solid to stand on, and the louder she spoke, the more she betrayed her own insecurity. By the time she sat across from Jasmine Crockett on that night, Kellyanne wasn't just fighting her opponents, she was fighting history. She carried the weight of every combative exchange she had ever staged, every gaslight that had once seemed clever but now looked grotesque under the lens of hindsight. She had built her legacy on confrontation, but in doing so, she had made herself a prisoner of her own combative style. She could never afford to be calm, because calmness required substance. She could never afford to be humble, because humility required honesty. So, she did the only thing she knew how to do. She got louder. Her raised voice wasn't a strategy, it was a survival instinct. The flailing of someone who sensed control slipping away. What made the meltdown so striking wasn't just its volume, but its inevitability. Kellyanne had trained audiences to expect spin, not screams. And yet, as the years had chipped away at her veneer, this explosion became the logical conclusion of her arc. The hubris that once shielded her had become the very fuel of her undoing too. Millions watching, it wasn't just a bad night on television, It was the collapse of a persona that had seemed unshakable. The woman who once turned lies into headlines was now reduced to shouting at shadows. The louder she tried to dominate the moment, the more fragile she appeared. Each scream revealed not power, but panic. Each outburst confirmed that the empire of spin she had built was crumbling under its own weight, and that is why this clash mattered so deeply. This wasn't Kellyanne in her prime, confident and cunning. This was Kellyanne at the end of a long descent, her tricks exhausted, her arrogance laid bare. Sitting across from Jasmine Crockett, she became a caricature of herself, a strategist, more spectacle. The irony was almost poetic. The woman who once prided herself on controlling the narrative had lost control of her own. And as the cameras captured every second, as the world watched her unravel in real time, one truth crystallized: the louder Kellyanne Conway shouted, the closer she came to exposing her own weakness. But across from her sat someone who represented the opposite trajectory, a figure whose power was just beginning to rise. And the nation would soon see how composure, not chaos, can change the course of history. Long before Jasmine Crockett sat beneath the glare of studio lights, long before millions would watch her steady gaze dismantle Kellyanne Conway's fury, her story had already been written in quieter, harder places. She grew up in a working-class household, surrounded not by the privileges of power, but by the struggles and grit that come with making ends meet. Her path was never cushioned, never handed down. It was forged step by step, through long nights, heavy books, and a conviction that her voice mattered, even when the world tried to silence it. As a young woman, Jasmine found herself drawn not to the easy or the glamorous, but to the fight for justice. She studied law not as a ticket to wealth, but as a weapon for those who had none. In her years as a civil rights attorney, she walked into courtrooms where her clients carried wounds the system had overlooked: racial profiling, discrimination, wrongful arrests. She carried their stories on her shoulders, and with every case, she argued, she built not only her reputation, but her identity as someone who would not back down when dignity was on the line. Her courtroom style was never about theatrics. Jasmine's power wasn't in volume, it was in presence. Judges noticed how she spoke with calm precision, even as her opponents grew red-faced and flustered. Juries leaned in because her words carried weight, not bluster. She learned early that silence could be louder than shouting, and that dignity, when held tightly, could become a force impossible to rattle. That lesson would follow her all the way to the stage where she faced Kellyanne Conway. Her leap into politics was not born of ambition alone, but of necessity. Jasmine had watched too many lives upended by decisions made in rooms far from the people they affected. She understood that the law could heal wounds, but legislation could prevent them. When she ran for office, she did so as the underdog, the candidate without the corporate bankrolls, the one who relied on door-knocking, grassroots energy. In the faith of neighbors who saw themselves reflected in her fight, and against the odds, she won. In Congress, she quickly became known as a voice unafraid to speak uncomfortable truths. She did not smooth her edges to please the powerful. She did not dim her fire to fit the mold of polite politics. Instead, she carried the urgency of her community into every hearing, every committee, every debate. For Jasmine, leadership was not about titles. It was about service. And service in her eyes meant showing up for those who had been told there. Voices did not matter. It was this authenticity, this unshakable connection to real people, that made her so dangerous to someone like Kellyanne Conway. Kellyanne had spent decades in the rarefied air of political consultancy, where narratives were manufactured like products on a conveyor belt. Jasmine, by contrast, was not a product, she was a person, with scars and victories that could not be rehearsed or scripted away. She did not need to shout to be heard, because her truth already carried further than Kellyanne's noise. And so when Jasmine took her seat at that debate table, she carried more than her own voice. She carried the weight of communities who had always been underestimated, dismissed, or drowned out by louder, wealthier, whiter voices. Her calm in the face of Kellyanne's storm was not weakness. It was the embodiment of everything she had lived. Jasmine knew storms. She had grown up inside them, fought them in courtrooms, confronted them in legislative battles. What millions of viewers didn't see, but felt, was that this moment was not new to her, was destiny meeting preparation. Jasmine's silence. Against Kellyanne's rage was the silence of someone who had been underestimated all her life, and who had learned that composure could be sharper than any insult. Each second she refused to be baited, she reminded the world that there is more strength and dignity than in derision. For the progressive audience who watched, there was an almost spiritual validation in her presence. They saw in Jasmine a reflection of their own struggles, immigrant families who worked twice as hard for half as much. Young women told to stay quiet in rooms where men spoke over them. Activists dismissed as naive for believing in justice. In Jasmine's unflinching calm, they found themselves vindicated. And yet Jasmine was never one to claim perfection. She knew the weight of mistakes, the sting of setbacks, but what set her apart was her ability to turn those struggles into fuel rather than defeat. She understood that authenticity meant not hiding her scars, but showing how she had carried them into strength. That night on live television, when Kellyanne Conway unleashed her tirade, Jasmine did not need to force herself into calm. She simply leaned on the foundation of a life lived in service, in struggle, and in truth. This was not a new fight for her. This was exactly the kind of storm Jasmine Crockett had been preparing her whole life to face. And as the nation leaned closer to their screens, waiting for her reply, they weren't just waiting for words, they were waiting for history to pivot. Because when Jasmine finally chose to speak, it would not just be a clapback. It would be the voice of every underdog who had ever been underestimated, finally claiming its power in front of the world. Back in the studio, the air thickened with each passing second. Kellyanne Conway, already frayed from her opening outburst, seized on every opportunity to interrupt. Whenever Jasmine began to speak, Kellyanne's voice barreled over her, a storm of sarcasm and sneering laughter. She leaned across the desk, her hands chopping through the air, her tone dripping with disdain. Every sentence was less an argument, and more a performance of derision, as if the volume of her voice could erase the emptiness of her claims. The anchor, caught between the chaos, attempted to restore order. "Let's allow Congresswoman Crockett to finish her thought," but before the words left his lips, Kellyanne pounced again. "Finish her thought, please. She doesn't even have one worth listening to." Her laughter rang hollow, forced, designed to provoke. Cameras caught the anchor's wince, his futile shuffle of papers, his nervous glance toward the control booth as if asking for rescue. Yet amid the barrage, Jasmine did not flinch. She sat steady, posture upright but unstrained, her eyes fixed not on the chaos before her, but through it. She didn't attempt to shout over Kellyanne. She didn't raise her hands or tighten her jaw. Instead, she let the storm exhaust itself against the immovable wall of her calm. That, more than any retort, began to shift the energy in the room. The audience watching at home could feel the contrast. On one half of the screen, Kellyanne raged, her interruptions frantic, her mocking tone verging on desperation. The other half, Jasmine, remained composed, her stillness a form of quiet defiance. It was a split screen that told a story louder than words. Chaos versus composure. Arrogance versus assurance. Every time Kellyanne's voice cracked with frustration, Jasmine's silence became heavier, more commanding. Viewers on social media began typing in real time, their comments flashing across timelines. Why is Jasmine not reacting? She's letting Kellyanne bury herself? This calm is powerful. The debate had transformed into theater, and the hero wasn't. The one speaking it was the one choosing not to, as Kellyanne continued. Her tone shifted from dismissive to frantic. She mocked Jasmine's career, belittled her intelligence, tried to spin caricatures that no longer landed. The louder she became, the more obvious her desperation grew. The very tools that had once made her untouchable, the smirk, the condescension, the feigned superiority, were collapsing under the weight of their overuse. What once looked like control now looked like unraveling. Meanwhile, Jasmine's composure was doing something unexpected. It was turning the audience against Kellyanne without a single word spoken. The anchors sensed it too. Their attempts to Calm, the exchange grew weaker, their voices drowned out by Kellyanne's tirade. One anchor shot a glance toward Jasmine, almost pleading for her to intervene, to restore balance where moderation had failed. And Jasmine did respond, not with words, not yet, but with the smallest shift in posture. She leaned back slightly, folded her hands on the table, and raised her chin, her gaze unwavering. The cameras caught it, the subtle poise of someone entirely unshaken, someone who understood that patience itself was a weapon. The studio audience, silent now, seemed to lean forward collectively, waiting. Kellyanne, oblivious to how much ground she had already lost, mistook Jasmine's silence for weakness. "Cat got your tongue, Congresswoman?" she jeered, her voice shrill with mockery. "Or maybe you just don't have the guts to answer me directly." She laughed again, a brittle sound that bounced awkwardly around the studio, failing to land. But Jasmine's stillness told a different story. It wasn't the silence of intimidation, it was the silence of strategy. A silence that made Kellyanne's noise echo louder, harsher, more desperate by contrast. Viewers at home felt it. In their chests, something was building, something that could not be delayed much longer. The anchor tried one last time, voice trembling at the edges. "Congresswoman Crockett, would you like to respond?" And that's when it happened. Jasmine finally moved, not rushed, not rattled, but deliberate. She leaned forward, her hands still folded, her voice unspoken but imminent. The studio froze. The anchors stopped. Even Kellyanne's laughter faltered into silence. The moment had arrived. And then Jasmine leaned forward with a reply that changed everything. The studio had fallen into a rare, crystalline silence. For the first time all night, Kellyanne Conway had nothing to say. Her laughter sputtered out like a flame, gasping for oxygen. Every eye in the room turned toward Jasmine Crockett, who leaned forward slowly, her posture radiating composure, her gaze locked not on Kellyanne's fury, but on the truth she was about to unleash. When Jasmine finally spoke, her tone was measured, deliberate. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Each syllable carried weight, like a gavel striking in a courtroom. "You know," she began softly, her eyes steady, "it's remarkable how much noise can come from so little substance." The audience stirred. A few muffled laughs broke through. The anchor's eyebrows shot up, and for a moment, Kellyanne blinked, unsure whether she had just been dismissed or destroyed. Jasmine continued, her voice calm but cutting, every word wrapped in silk yet sharpened to a blade. "You've spent years," Jasmine said, gesturing gently toward Kellyanne, telling the American people that up is down, that lies are truth, that chaos is order. You made a career out of gaslighting the country. Tonight you've tried to do the same thing to me. But here's the difference. Like you, I don't have to shout to be heard. I don't have to twist myself into knots to defend the indefensible." Sharp inhale swept through the studio audience. Up. Even the anchor leaned back in his chair, as if to get out of the way of what was coming. Kellyanne opened her mouth to interject, but Jasmine raised her hand slightly, just enough to command the space without breaking her composure. The gesture landed with the authority of a judge silencing a courtroom. "Let's talk about hypocrisy." Jasmine pressed on, her tone steady as a surgeon's hand. "You sit here mocking my intelligence, my career, my worthiness. But the truth is, I earned my place in this seat. I worked my way up, from a working-class family, through law school, into courtrooms where real people's lives were on the line. I didn't inherit power. I didn't marry into it. I fought for it. I bled for it. And I represent people who don't have the luxury of screaming their way out of accountability." The audience gasped. Ripple moved across the room, one of recognition, of resonance. Social media feeds lit up with the clip, even as it was happening. Jasmine's words weren't just rebuttal. They were revelation. Kellyanne shifted uncomfortably in her chair, the flush rising in her face betraying what her words could not cover. "That's not," she began, but her voice cracked, the first tremor of a fortress beginning to crumble. Jasmine didn't falter. Her calm only grew stronger. "You've called me unprepared. You've called me unworthy. But let's be honest, Ms. Conway, what have you given this country? You've handed us alternative facts. You've defended cruelty as policy. You screamed for years to distract from what you could never prove. And now you sit here shouting again, as though volume will fill the void where credibility used to be. The anchor's mouth opened slightly, as if he, too, was stunned at the precision of the strike. The studio audience had stopped breathing. Afraid to miss a word, Kellyanne tried again, fumbling for her familiar smirk, but it didn't come. That's not fair," she stammered, her voice thinner, less certain. Jasmine leaned closer, her voice still unshaken. "Fair? You want to talk about fair? Tell the immigrant child whose parents work 3 jobs if life is fair. Tell the mother who buries her son because of police brutality if life is fair. Fairness doesn't come from the spin you pedal on. TVIT comes from people like me, fighting every day to give those voices a chance to be heard." The studio erupted in applause. Even the anchors struggled to hide their reactions, their wide-eyed looks betraying astonishment at the momentum shift unfolding before them. Kellyanne attempted to cut in, waving her hand as though swatting away. Jasmine's words, the more she tried, the less control she had. Her voice cracked again, her rehearsed lines unraveling into incoherent fragments. For years she had dominated with fast talk and deflection, but in the face of Jasmine's quiet clarity, those tricks collapsed into dust. Jasmine paused. She let the silence sit heavy, letting Kellyanne's stammering echo in the void. Then she delivered the line that would echo across the country. "You see, Miss Conway, real strength isn't measured by who can scream the loudest. Real strength is measured by who can stay calm when screamed at. Chaos is easy. Dignity, that's hard. And that's the difference between you and me, between arrogance and service, between noise and justice." The crowd gasped, as if a physical blow had landed. The anchor's pen slipped from his hand. Somewhere in the control booth, a producer muttered, "We just went viral." For a full 3 seconds, Kellyanne said nothing. Her lips parted, but no words emerged. Her face flushed deeper. The smirk was gone. The condescension was gone. What remained was silence, the kind of silence that signals defeat. And Jasmine. She leaned back in her chair, eyes steady, hands folded once again, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. It was composure distilled into human form. She didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate. She simply let the truth hang in the air, undeniable, inescapable. The anchor finally broke the silence, voice trembling. "Congresswoman Crockett, thank you." That was he stopped himself, unable to find the words. Kellyanne glanced toward. The cameras visibly rattled. She tried to recover, but her voice betrayed Hurst, stammering, fragile, almost pleading. The woman who had once commanded the airwaves was now undone by her own tactics, and across the country, viewers leaned forward, phones in hand, already sharing the moment that would flood their timelines by morning. Because in one calm counterattack, Jasmine Crockett had dismantled years of arrogance, exposed the emptiness of bluster, and reminded the nation that dignity still mattered. The nation held its breath, and then, just as the cameras cut to commercial, happened behind the scenes would send shockwaves across the country the moment the broadcast cut to commercial. The clip had already escaped into the wild. On Twitter now, rebranded Xta hashtags began to climb like rockets in the night sky. Hashtag Jasmine wins shot to the top of the trending list within minutes, followed closely by hashtag.com over chaos. Viewers didn't wait for the pundits. It became the pundits. Screens across America lit up with side-by-side clips. Kellyanne Conway red-faced and shouting. Jasmine Crockett sitting perfectly composed. Her silence heavier than thunder. By the time the debate returned from break, the internet had already declared a winner. TikTok flooded with memes, one of the most viral split the screen between Kellyanne's scream and Jasmine calmly sipping water, captioned, "Volume doesn't equal victory." Another looped Jasmine's mic drop line, "Chaos is easy. Dignity, that's hard," set to triumphant background music. With creators adding their own reactions, gasps, cheers, even tears. On Instagram, reels spread like wildfire. One featured a slowed-down replay of Jasmine's calm gaze as Kellyanne faltered. The words, "This is what leadership looks like," plastered across the frame. Facebook groups, long the battleground of family political debates, lit up with relatives tagging one another. "Watch this. This is the moment." Cable news couldn't resist. That same evening, pundits dissected the exchange frame by frame. CNN replayed Jasmine's line about dignity at least a dozen times in one segment, noting how rare it was to see someone turn silence into a weapon. MSNBC anchors spoke of a generational moment, describing Jasmine as the voice of a future America. Even Fox News, though quick to defend Kellyanne, couldn't avoid broadcasting the clip, ironically giving it more oxygen and reach. Then came late night. Stephen Colbert opened with a split-screen meme. Jimmy Fallon joked that Kellyanne had lost a debate with her own volume knob. Trevor Noah, returning for a guest spot, simply replayed Jasmine's final line and let the audience roar. The laughter carrying as if it belonged to the entire country, but the most profound reaction didn't come from celebrities or anchors. It came from ordinary people. Twitter threads popped up with viewers telling their own stories. A daughter who remembered her immigrant mother staying calm in the face of constant insults at work. A young black student who said Jasmine reminded him of his grandmother, quietly powerful, never rattled. A nurse who wrote about choosing calm over anger with patients in crisis. Jasmine's composure became more than a viral moment. It became a mirror for millions who had lived their own versions of calm versus chaos. The ripple effect grew by the hour. Churches brought up the exchange in Sunday sermons, framing it as a lesson in humility. College classrooms replayed the clip as an example of rhetoric meeting restraint. Activists shared it as evidence that politics didn't have to be dominated by noise and cruelty, that composure could be revolutionary. Celebrities amplified it too. Ava DuVernay tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett just gave a masterclass in strength. Leaders don't scream, they lead." John Legend posted the split-screen meme on Instagram with the caption, "Volume isn't victory." Even athletes weighed in, comparing Jasmine's patience to the focus of a star player under pressure in the final seconds of a game. The narrative spread beyond politics, weaving itself into everyday conversations. In workplaces, coworkers joked about pulling a Jasmine when responding calmly to a rude customer. Parents showed the clip to their kids as an example of standing strong without losing your cool. It wasn't just about Democrats versus Republicans anymore. It was about the universal battle between chaos and composure, arrogance and dignity, hate and humanity. And through it all, Jasmine herself stayed grounded. She didn't gloat. She didn't amplify the memes. She simply released a short statement the next morning. "I believe dignity is stronger than hate." That's what I carried into that debate, and that's what I'll carry into my work every day. Her words were simple, but the timing made them feel historic. In just 24 hours, she had transformed from a rising star into a national symbol. Not because she shouted, not because she dominated the screen with spectacle, but because she chose restraint. And in doing so, reminded America of something it had nearly forgotten. Composure is not weakness. Composure is strength. Jasmine wasn't just defending herself that night. She was defending the very idea that dignity can still triumph over hate. And the country, hungry for that reminder, clung to it, shared it, made it their own. But as the internet crowned its victor, and as millions replayed the exchange, no one could predict what would happen next behind the cameras, in the corridors of power, where the shockwaves of that night would echo far louder than any scream. When the dust of the debate finally settled, what lingered wasn't Kellyanne Conway's shouting. It wasn't the insults, the interruptions, or the sneers. What endured, what etched itself into memory, was Jasmine Crockett's stillness. Her calm reply became more than a rebuttal. It became a parable, a living demonstration that composure, when wielded with courage, is stronger than cruelty. Jasmine reframed the entire exchange not as a battle of egos, but as a lesson for the country. By refusing to meet rage with rage, she showed that dignity doesn't just survive chaos, it conquers. She turned the scream meant to intimidate her into the stage on which her calm became unshakable. And in that moment, millions of Americans saw a model of the kind of leadership they longed for. Leadership that doesn't crumble under pressure. that doesn't mistake volume for vision, that doesn't confuse insults with ideas. This clash wasn't simply about one woman against another. It was about two Americas, one that thrives on division, noise, and manipulation, and another that aspires to clarity, justice, and grace. Kellyanne embodied the old politics of spectacle, a politics where truth is bent until it breaks, where arrogance masquerades as authority. Jasmine embodied something newer, something braver, an America that refuses to be dragged into the mud, that insists real strength lies in composure, not chaos. And when she spoke those words, chaos is easy. That's hard. Struck a chord deeper than politics. Teachers repeated it in classrooms. Parents whispered it to their children. Activists wrote it on posters. It became a mantra, a reminder that in a world constantly shouting, there is power in refusing to scream back. The inspirational crescendo of that night was not loud. It was steady, rising like a tide. In one calm reply, commentators wrote, Jasmine reminded us all that true strength doesn't scream. That single line carried the weight of a nation's exhaustion with anger and its hunger for something higher. People weren't just applauding Jasmine, they were affirming the kind of America they wanted to believe in again, because underneath all the politics, beneath the noise of parties and pundits, this was about something universal. The human desire to be seen, heard, and respected without having to shout. Jasmine gave voice to that desire in a way that felt personal to millions. For the immigrant family who had been told to go back where you came from, for the young black professional spoken over in boardrooms, for the quiet worker mocked for their accent, her calm became their victory. And so the moment transcended politics, transforming into a movement of its own. Viewers didn't just watch, they felt part of it. They shared it not only because it was viral, but because it validated something within themselves. To stand with Jasmine was to stand for dignity. To celebrate her composure was to declare that cruelty had not won in the end. Jasmine Crockett's greatest triumph wasn't silencing Kellyanne Conway, it was reminding the rest of us that we don't have to surrender to chaos. That the America worth fighting for is not one where the loudest voice dominates, but one where the clearest vision leads. And as the story spread, as the words repeated in millions of homes and hearts, people began to believe again in the power of quiet strength, because dignity doesn't fade, it doesn't tire, it doesn't scream. It simply stands unshaken and lets the world recognize it for what it is. True power. That night, Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a debate, she lit a beacon. And for those watching, the message was clear. This isn't just her fight. Ours. The movement of dignity belongs to everyone willing to carry it forward. Kellyanne Conway screamed. Jasmine Crockett stayed calm. History remembered the calm. That single contrast defined not just a debate, but a moment that will echo far beyond one studio stage. Because while chaos tried to dominate, dignity quietly claimed the victory and the world saw it happen in real time. This wasn't just about politics. It wasn't about party lines or television ratings. It was about something deeper, about what kind of America we want to live in. Do we want a future built on rage and arrogance, where the loudest voice drowns out all others? Or do we want a future where strength is measured in composure, where clarity speaks louder than shouting, and where dignity refuses to be silenced? Jasmine's calm reply went viral, not because it was flashy, but because it was true. It was the kind of truth that cuts through noise, the kind of truth people carry with them long after the clip ends. It reminded us that real power doesn't need to scream, it simply speaks. And the world listens. And now the story is in your hands. If you believe in dignity over arrogance, in justice over chaos, in truth over noise, share this moment. It rippled further. Let it be the reminder someone else needs tonight. Subscribe to this channel and join a community that refuses to let rage define our future, a community that knows calm. Clarity and dignity are the values worth amplifying. Because one viral clip can spark a conversation with millions of voices. Choosing dignity together, that can spark a movement. Kellyanne screamed. Jasmine stayed calm. and the future will always remember the calm.